Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for that introduction, Professor Kidman. So, in my 2016 book, The Great War for New Zealand, I argued that it was the invasion of Waikato in 1863 and not either World War that was the defining conflict in New Zealand history. War in the Waikato shaped the nation in many ways and caused incalculable misery and lasting harm for many Māori communities. But as the same book highlighted, it also sealed Auckland's future. So given the location for today's symposium, I thought it was appropriate to describe how the conflict played out in Tāmaki, Makaurau, and the scars that it's left behind for this city. So the first thing to note is that my book was subtitled Waikato 1800 to 2000, and that was very much intended to signal that in order to understand that conflict in its full context, we also need to know the before and the after. It's not just the story of a 9-month military campaign, but the story of how we got to where we are today. So I'm going to take that wide view in this talk also. So on the 18th of September 1840, a party of Crown officials landed at the foot of what was to become known as Queen Street, at the site subsequently known as Point Britomart. On that day, Ngāti Whātua Rangatira, led by Apihai Te Kāwau, gifted an area of over 3,000 acres for a new township. The township and future city of Auckland had been founded on that day. And indeed, formalising these arrangements was signed a month later, and Ngāti Whātua were given cash and goods valued at £273. 6 months later, when the Crown sold 44 acres of the block, it received £24,000 for that, so an astronomical profit. Auckland became the capital of the colony, attracting not just settlers, but also Māori from across the North Island, lured by the trading opportunities. And many were hosted by Ngāti Whātua at Arake and Okahu, and a native hostel was later also built at Waipapa Mechanics Bay, near the corner of Parnell Rise and Stanley Street. Ngāti Whātua gained prestige from these arrangements, but also saw pressure on their remaining lands across the Tāmaki Isthmus, which was soon acquired by the Crown and settlers. Any real benefits they gained soon evaporated, as Pākehā and the Crown enriched themselves at their expense, and that's a story we don't really fully acknowledge today. By 1845, the township of Auckland remained relatively small. The population was just over 3,000 people, and it also faced an existential crisis. War raged in the north, and it was rumoured that the assistance of the powerful Tainui tribes had been sought for an attack on the settlement. And so a nightmare scenario for the town's residents was the prospect of a simultaneous attack from north and south, with Ngāpuhi and Tainui combining to virtually assure Auckland's destruction. Yet when a delegation came south to solicit assistance from Paramount Tainui Rangatira to Wherowhero, the response was emphatic. "You must fight me if you come onto Auckland, for these Europeans are under my protection," he told them. In Māori terms, Te Wherowhero made the position even clearer, referring to Auckland as the hem of his cloak, and in this way placing the settlement under his personal tapu. An attack on Auckland would be an attack on him. Reinforcing this point, in 1845, the government built a cottage for Te Wherowhero within Auckland Domain, close to where the museum currently stands. I believe it's thought to be close to the fence line with the hospital. It was one of several residences that the chief had across the Tāmaki region. A year earlier, in 1844, the Tainui tribes, with a population of roughly 18,000, hosted a massive hakari or feast on their Remuera estate, attended by over 3,400 Māori guests and more than 1,000 Europeans. This was a big deal in the city of Auckland. By 1849, this protective role had been formalised when over 120 Tainui men and their families were allocated lands at Mangere in return for regular military duties in protecting Auckland. And those were precisely the same terms as the fencibles were recruited on. They were given land in return for protecting the settlement. The Waikato tribes had a long association with the Manukau harbour, especially, and Manukau became the centre of a flourishing Tainui settlement. And Māori weren't just defending the settlement of Auckland. In 1844, the Southern Cross newspaper commented that, quote, "The present European population would have been literally starved out of the country, but for the extraordinary exertions made by the Aboriginal inhabitants to supply them with cheap provisions." Years later, the same newspaper, which eventually merged with the New Zealand Herald, would vehemently call for the Tainui tribes to be attacked and their land stripped from them. But at a time when the settlers were entirely dependent on the tribes for their survival, it could happily describe Māori as, quote, the greatest benefit and the greatest blessing we have in New Zealand. Ngāti Whātua, Tainui and other iwi developed a thriving economy based on feeding the settlers of Auckland. By the 1850s, flour mills were dotted across the Waikato landscape and produce was being exported as far as the goldfields of California and Victoria. Māori were New Zealand's leading export earners and key contributors to the government's coffers. Tainui were at the forefront of these developments, and it was almost inconceivable in the early 1850s that less than a decade later they would stand accused of plotting the imminent massacre of Auckland's residents. So within the space of a decade, they go from being considered firm friends to people plotting to attack the settlement. Those allegations were not only entirely unfounded, but also illogical. Destroying the key outlet for their projects would have been suicidal for Tainui. Their wealth and therefore power depended to a large degree on Auckland's ongoing well-being. But how did it even come to pass that they might be accused of such a thing? Well, for one thing, as settler numbers grew, their reliance on Māori lessened, and at the same time, demand for Māori land was also increasing. Lurking Victorian assumptions of racial superiority over native peoples began to come to the fore. Great rangatira complained of being racially abused in Auckland and Pākehā townships like Auckland, in contrast to the hospitality that even lowly Europeans received whenever they visited Māori settlements. Here's a key moment as well. In 1858, Europeans outnumbered Māori for the first time. So Māori are outnumbered in their own country. And while Pākehā were happy for Māori to feed and defend them, they weren't prepared to share the governance of the colony with the chiefs. In 1852, a new constitution for the colony established a parliament and provincial assemblies from which Māori were effectively excluded because the right to vote was based on European forms of land tenure. And so when Parliament met for the first time here in Auckland in May 1854, great rangatira like Te Whiruwhiru, Apihai Te Kawo and others had no part in the proceedings. The All Pākehā Parliament represented only settler interests, and they were entirely antagonistic towards Māori interests. In 1860, Ngāti Whātua hosted a large gathering of rangatira from around the country at Kohimarama, calling for Māori to be allowed a share in the governance of the colony, while at the same time affirming their relationship with Queen Victoria under Te Tiriti o Waitangi. But Governor Grey cancelled plans for the conference to become an annual event, declaring that he saw no benefit in allowing barbarians to convene in order to frame a constitution for themselves. So the kingitanga or king movement was one of the ways in which Māori responded to their growing marginalisation. Despite initial reluctance, in 1858, an elderly Te Whiruwhiru was raised up as the first king. A pivotal hui had earlier been held at Ihumātao to debate the move. And although some Europeans welcomed these developments, that the kingitanga could not be allowed to stand became official Crown policy, paving the way for the invasion of Waikato in July 1863. So in this way, the Great War for New Zealand broke out less than 50 kilometres from Queen Street. European men within Auckland aged between 16 and 55 were conscripted for military service. MPs, lunatics and priests were exempted. Others volunteered. Meanwhile, Ngāti Whātua and other Māori within the township were placed under a nightly curfew, and those deemed friendly were issued with arm badges to identify them so that they wouldn't be assaulted by settlers. Shopkeepers found the presence of more than 10,000 imperial troops a huge boon for business. Some observers, including some of the troops, began to suspect that the war was being prolonged for their benefit. Auckland's future as a major site of commerce was secured, and with it the seed sown for the North Island's eventual dominance over the south. In the days immediately prior to the war, the Tainui residents of Mangere and other settlements in South Auckland had been forcibly evicted from their homes. An ultimatum was issued to the tribes on the 9th of July 1863, and officials dispatched to Mangere, Ihumātao, Tuakau and other settlements to deliver the demands the following day. All Māori living between Auckland and Waikato were required to swear an oath of allegiance to the Crown or immediately leave. A faulty translation meant that many understood the oath as an order to leave, or else feared that they might be required to fight for the Crown against their own kin. Few were willing to take the oath under these circumstances. Tamati Ngāpōra, one of the leaders of the Mangere community, pleaded for the alleged wrongs of the kingitanga to be investigated before attacking them. His appeal was rejected and entire communities forced off their lands at gunpoint, taking with them only what they could carry. With Māori pushed off their own lands in South Auckland, a second ultimatum was issued, this time dated the 11th of July 1863, and addressed to the chiefs of Waikato. It recited the familiar allegations against Waikato Māori and declared that the government had been compelled to establish military posts at several points on the Waikato River, and that the lives and property of all well-disposed people would be protected. Those who waged war, on the other hand, were to suffer the consequences, including forfeiting all rights to their lands guaranteed to them under the Treaty of Waitangi. Crucially, that ultimatum was still being drafted on the 13th of July, one day after Lieutenant General Duncan Cameron led British troops across the Magatawhiri River, marking the start of the invasion of the Waikato. In other words, not only did Tainui have no opportunity to respond to the ultimatum, saving their lives and lands, but it was never intended that they should have that chance. The ultimatum was mere window dressing, intended to cloak a premeditated Crown invasion by making it appear a just war, fought reluctantly, and that couldn't have been further from the truth. So this is a cynical move of window dressing. 4 days after the invasion begins, on the 16th of July 1863, British troops and their colonial allies invaded the Te Akitai Waihua settlement of Kirikiri near Papakura in South Auckland, where rangatira Ihaka Takanini and others were taken prisoner. The government accused Ihaka Takanini of plotting a wholesale massacre of a part of the European population, but later admitted that there was no legal basis for their subsequent imprisonment. A number of the group died during their captivity, including Ihaka Takanini himself, who passed away soon after they were moved to Rakino Island in the Hauraki Gulf in November 1863. And it was said that he had died of homesickness and a broken heart. Ihaka Takanini, like many of the South Auckland rangatira, had previously been regarded as a warm friend of Pākehā, and so the allegations against him, unfounded as they were, cut deep. Whole communities were torn apart and destroyed in the war. The Waikato War ended at Arako in April 1864, when over half the 300 occupants of the pub were ruthlessly hunted down and killed by armed cavalry when they attempted to flee on foot. Those who managed to flee from Arako made their way across the Punu River to what became known as the King Country. The population there doubled overnight, while the lands available to support the people had shrunk considerably, and in the cramped and unsanitary living conditions, outbreaks of disease were common. Large numbers died in the first few years after the war, including reported cases of starvation. That followed on top of a war in which Māori casualty rates might have been higher on a per capita basis than those suffered by New Zealand troops during World War I, which is conventionally considered the greatest bloodbath in New Zealand history. Generations of Tainui were condemned to lives of poverty and landlessness, while the fertile confiscated lands of Waikato enriched a handful of Auckland speculators, some of whom, like Thomas Russell and Frederick Whittaker, were actually members of Parliament and ministers in the government at the time of the invasion in 1863. And these lands, of course, would eventually form the basis of a lucrative dairy industry from which Māori were mostly sidelined. And the effects weren't just felt in Waikato. Settlers swarmed to the deserted Māori settlements in South Auckland in the early months of the war, helping themselves to whatever they liked. Houses were ransacked and destroyed, cattle looted, crops destroyed, and over 20 waka broken up and used for firewood, though one waka belonging to Ngāti Tiata called Te Tokia Tapiri was kept intact and of course is today housed in Auckland Museum. Another war trophy house here is the Aotearoa flag made by Wahine Toa Hine Te Kiri Karamu and seized by forest rangers at Paparata in December 1863. It was handed to Auckland City in 1913 on the 50th anniversary of that, and it's now in very poor condition. For most of the 20th century, it hanged over the entrance to Auckland Public Library, and a Māori who visited there in the 1920s said it was offensive to him because it was like a war trophy from an enemy, so he didn't feel welcome at that library. The scars of the Waikato War can be seen all over Auckland, whether that's in the Albert Barracks wall at the University of Auckland, Old Government House, now of course the University Staff Common Room, but in 1863 the place where Grey and his ministers plotted their invasion of Waikato. Streets named after those responsible for launching or taking part in the invasion, or later monuments and memorials to them, such as the statue of Sir George Grey in Albert Park that has been repeatedly attacked in recent years. I think this one was June 2020. Or the Simon Street New Zealand Wars Memorial, funded by the Victoria League and unveiled in 1920, This memorial reflects a particular way that Pākehā came to remember the wars for much of the 20th century. Conflicts believed to have sown the seeds for future harmony and even the best race relations in the world. Forged through mutual respect on the battlefield, a place of chivalrous and noble conflicts, rather than bloody and brutal ordeals marked by multiple atrocities. So we need to find ways of speaking about the past even when it's difficult or uncomfortable. That kind of honest self-reflection and dialogue is the basis for genuine reconciliation and healing. Symbols matter because they speak to who we are and what a society values, and who are going to be forgotten and ignored. So talking about monuments and memorials like these, or even street and place names, I think is a way of working through these wider issues. The Waikato will help transform Auckland into what it is today. It also marked the point at which the Treaty of Waitangi was cast aside for the next century or more. Māori aspirations for mutual prosperity and partnership went out the window at the same time. An era of unbridled Pākehā hegemony was ushered in instead. But before that time, Ngāti Whātua, Tainui and other iwi had contributed hugely to the development of Auckland. That's a story like the wider history of the Waikato War and other conflicts fought on these shores that's been little known or understood until recent times outside the iwi concerned. But I'd suggest that it's time as a nation that we acknowledge, understand and own this history. It's part of our story as a nation, and fronting up to its past in an open, honest and mature way will put us in good stead for the future. It's the basis for reconciliation grounded in awareness and understanding. Thank you.